Welcome to Aviation United by AviationZorro. I'm delighted to be chatting with energy worker, author, teacher, certified mindfulness meditation instructor, certified feeding your demons facilitator, and mom of three, Lisa Erickson. A very good day to you, Lisa. How are you getting on?
I am great. How are you today, David?
Wonderful. So we crack on with this normal question every podcast we do. So where are you right now on planet Earth?
I am in Redondo Beach, California,
Oh,
which is a
nice.
suburb of Los Angeles.
Oh, sounds
Yes.
very, very, very nice. I'm going to ask you, obviously, the typical weather questions. What's it like at the moment? Because it's freezing here in Ireland. It's really cold, so make me jealous. Make our listeners
Okay,
jealous.
well, it's cold for us, but that's like mid 60s. So 60s
All right.
Fahrenheit, of course. So for
Okay.
us.
Well,
And it's a
66 is good for
little
us
bit
anyway.
cloudy.
Was
Yeah,
it a bit
yeah.
cloudy? Because like similar to like the Baywatch type of thing. Like,
It's
beautiful
not quite
wave.
Baywatch, but I am fairly near the ocean, and very lucky to live near the ocean. And yes, although I am in LA County and we're under very strict COVID restrictions right now, so we're not supposed to be out walking around because we've had a very big surge here. So yeah.
Oh dear. And is there any, have they told you how long you'll be in lockdown?
Through Christmas.
Oh,
through
wow.
Christmas.
Alrighty.
Yeah, so we're not supposed to see, not everyone is doing it, but we're not supposed to be seeing anyone other than our immediate household. So we'll see how it goes.
Well, I'll ask you generally, tell our listeners a little bit about your background.
Yeah. So I am, as you said, an energy worker and an author, and I work with people one-on-one and in workshops on healing. I'm really a kind of almost like a counselor, but I've specialized a lot in individuals who've experienced abuse, sexual abuse, domestic abuse, and violence. I work mostly with women, but I do also work with men around those themes. And the kind of work that I do, it isn't your traditional therapy counseling. I incorporate a lot of meditation and guided energy center meditation and contemplations to help individuals to heal from the trauma of having been in an abusive situation.
Kind of kick it off from my own, understanding. I mean, what is domestic abuse? What's domestic violence? Are they the same? Are they different? Or
they are in most cases used interchangeably. So, for example, here in the States, some states use the word domestic abuse in a legal context and define it, and some use domestic violence, and they're pretty interchangeable. So you don't find a universal differentiation between one versus the other, and at a legal level, they are considered the same thing. And from a legal perspective, in terms of what is incriminating, it is physical violence,
right.
Encroaching on someone's physical at any level, right? But we recognize from a therapeutic perspective, a psychological perspective, there's a lot of other kinds of abuse, right? It's not just physical. Someone could be mentally and emotionally abusive in a way that is extremely harmful, controlling, and disempowering.
So how then do you recognize that you're in this kind of abusive or I mean, I suppose if it's physical, you'd have a rough idea that's a violent relationship. But how would you actually know you're in this relationship? What are the signs?
Well, even physically it can, so maybe I'll speak to that first, because sometimes it can be very difficult when you're in it to recognize it even as a physically abusive relationship because of the cycle of abuse that often occurs. So maybe I should talk a little bit about that first, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, because the cycle of abuse is very often a relationship starts out often for a very long period of time. There is no abuse. That's not always the case. Sometimes there may be abusive episodes early on, but often there's not abuse for quite a long time until a relationship has settled into a domestic setting or things like that, or there's tremendous stress. But then once abuse starts, it tends to be cyclical. There's a cycle of abuse, an abusive episode, and then the abuser is very often repentant. And there can be this cycle of saying it'll never happen again. I just drank too much, I'll quit. Or it's because this happened at work, I'll never let it happen again. And then there can be sometimes long periods of time in which there is no abuse. So when that kind of cycle occurs, even when there's physical abuse, it can be difficult for someone to recognize and really name it as an abusive relationship. It's very similar to alcohol or drug addiction. Someone will be like, no, I'm going to quit. I'm going to quit for a week. And then they prove that in their mind, that proves to them they're not addicted, right? But in fact, it's just a different addictive cycle. So there are different abusive cycles. And in some cases, even when the abuse is physical, someone will keep telling themselves over and over, it's a one-time thing. it's because of this situation or that situation. Then, of course, there's also blaming that occurs. It's because I did XYZ. I triggered it. It's my fault, right? Which can also be part of that abusive cycle. Emotional and mental abuse then gets even more difficult to recognize because it isn't physical, but it's if there's constant beratement and there's a constant power imbalance or a constant invalidation of the other person, that is emotional and mental abuse. And again, it tends to run cyclically, but there is never any core healing underneath to what's happened. And of course, relationships can go through cycles, right? You can go through cycles of arguing, of fighting, or things like that. That's not the same thing as a cycle of emotional abuse when someone is continually and cyclically being disempowered and berated.
Is it possible, Lisa, then that the abuser, right, doesn't actually know that they're abusing another person? I mean, if they were, say, for example, brought up in a household which was quite an aggressive household or violent, it's quite normal. Is there any of that type of possibility that the abuser doesn't know they're doing it?
Very often that is the case. And this is the reality of abusive households, that a very high percentage of them, the abuser grew up in an abusive household themselves. So to them, it's just simply how relationships are, right? And that is a cultural issue that we have to change, right? We're coming to understand the implications because we're coming to understand how the trauma, how that impacts both the abuser and the abused, right? And how harmful it is in so many ways that impact women and children in particular over time, right? So we're starting to realize we have to change these. So we have to totally redefine relationships. So yeah, very often there isn't a sense. It's just a fight. It's just I drank too much. It's just you pissed me off. You pushed me too far. There's always it's that is kind of the mental story around it.
And then what can someone do kind of experiencing domestic abuse? I mean, there's a lot of advertisements in Ireland, particularly at the moment, and they're providing kind of these techniques for individuals experiencing abuse. I think there's a hand movement that if they're talking to somebody maybe on Skype or Zoom, they're trying to inform them that, I'm in a bit of bother here, a bit of trouble here. But what can somebody actually do to get help if they're experiencing abuse?
Right. So there's help. That example you just gave is really sort of like in the moment, right? Or if you're in a situation in which you can never be alone, or you're in a situation where you're being abused, right? In the time, in different countries, there are code words for if you call, right, to being able to signal, or like you said, hand signals, things like that, or if you're out in public in a store and you're never away from your abuser. So it's important to try to find ways to gain access to that information. I think more often it's about figuring out, planning a way to get away and finding the support structure to do that, right? Yes. And hopefully in the ideal situation, you actually have family members or friends whom you can speak to openly and go to that will offer protection and create that pathway for you. In far too many cases, there's so much secrecy and shame about having been abused that someone will not turn to the people they know. And that continues the cycle of abuse, right? Yes. If you can be in a marriage or a partnership that to the external world seems fine. And so there's too much embarrassment and shame around blowing that public image to go to anyone. And that keeps that cycle going until it's too late, until some major event occurs, right? So if you don't have someone in your life like that, it's really important to then reach out to professional resources. There are hotlines in every country that are dedicated just to this, where you can get anonymous support. So if you can get away at all, they can give you information on specifically where you might go anonymously, who you might speak to, what your legal rights are once you do, how to bring your children with you, what protection will be offered to you once you do that. If you need to go that route, there are hotlines available, and it's really important to find those.
Is it best then that if you are in a situation that you are being abused, do you retaliate, or is it best just to stay calm, wait for the situation to calm down a little bit, and then try to get help? I mean, has there been cases in the past where the person that's being abused has retaliated and it's escalated into something worse?
Yeah, I mean, the great majority of domestic violence is male on female. So in general, the male will be stronger than the female. That's not always the case, obviously, yes. Right? But it's part of the problem here, where a high amount of abuse does happen under the influence of alcohol or drugs. Not all, but it's often a contributing factor. And so retaliation in those circumstances just can be very dangerous, right? Now, obviously, sometimes you're fighting for your life, so you do whatever you have to do, right? You do whatever you have to do in that moment. But otherwise, trying to, in the moment, deflect, hide, get into a safe space, and ride out the cycle of rage, and then get out as soon as you can.
You mentioned there, Lisa, with regard to the physical side, obviously men being more physical generally than women. So for men that are experiencing domestic violence or abuse, I mean, what suggestion do you have for them? Because obviously we come across as this, kind of macho, and we're probably afraid to speak up or go to family or friends or even go to the police. And because stereotypically, maybe if a man, I know it sounds quite funny, but if a man was to go to the policeman and say, "Oh, my girlfriend or wife is beating me up," or something like that. But what's generally the reaction to that?
Yeah. And unfortunately, it's still not very valued, right? Although legally, it must be taken seriously. So I encourage someone to do that if they possibly can. In this case, however, reaching out to a professional counselor or psychologist or someone like that may be the first recourse to help you navigate the system in that way, because you'll be taken more seriously from someone that recognizes that trauma.
Right.
And whose job it is to help coach you through the transition. Most individuals need some sort of support or coaching through leaving. The psychology between the link between abuser and abused, it just gets very complicated, right? A lot of individuals who are abused feel guilty for leaving because they really truly believe it's either their fault or that their abuser needs them, right? Because there'll be this cycle of abuse, and then, "Oh, I need you so much, don't leave me, I'll change." And then abuse, and, "Oh, don't leave me, I need you so much." It's usually a very intense emotional relationship like that.
And is there any happy endings? I mean, has there been stories in the past or examples in the past where, there has been abuse within the relationship and then they lived happily ever after, or statistically, no, that doesn't happen?
Statistically, it is rare. It is possible. So let's talk about statistically. Statistically speaking, if someone has an abuser profile, unless they get very serious help, they will be a serial abuser in relationship after relationship. And that's why if the first time that you get hit by someone, statistically speaking, the chances are you are dealing with someone who is abuser personality. It's not a one-time event, and you have to take it very seriously. Now, that being said, there are abusers for whom their abusive cycles are primarily tied to drug or alcohol addiction. And in those cases, if someone pursues rehab and truly does get clean, right, and is able to maintain that and goes through the growth cycle of that, and then the relationship goes through counseling too, I do know circumstances where the couple recovered from that and totally changed the dynamic of the relationship, and the abuser was able to release the abusive pattern.
And when law enforcement gets involved, I mean, will the abuser, if they have been reported, will they be monitored? And will then the individuals that has been abused, I mean, will their story continue throughout the cycle to make sure they're protected?
Yeah, well, legally, yes, that's what should happen. Does it always happen? No. I mean, and this is part of the issue. It kind of depends on the sophistication of the particular police office that you're dealing with, and how attuned are they to abuse, how well trained are they, and how willing are they, right, to take it seriously and to intercede. Usually, and this may differ by country, to get permanent protection, you're going to have to file a restraining order or a protective order, right? Otherwise, that individual is not required to stay, stay away from you, et cetera, right? And that gets complicated if you have children and all these sorts of things. So the level of legal protection that you are offered is, based on what's been filed officially. And then beyond that, it's based on the willingness. And so I wish it was always universally enforced. It's unfortunately not. And that's why turning to nonprofit and professional organizations and support structures who specialize in this kind of thing can be very helpful. Because then if you're living in, say, a halfway home that is for those who've been abused, et cetera, that affords you a certain amount.
The long-term effects then of somebody being abused, I mean, what are we talking about here? I mean, you mentioned it because of physical and emotional, and everybody could be kind of different of how they recover. But what's the general recovery period from abuse?
Well, it's a trauma. And when we talk about trauma, we often we talk about or PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, right? We talk about war veterans, and we talk about people who've been through accidents or natural disasters, but living especially in a physically abusive relationship for year after years, and especially for children, a lot of the long-term, it is like working through trauma. So it is often, it's individual how someone might react, but it can cause long-term shifts in someone psychologically. They may have triggers. They may have deep fears and trigger situations in terms of anxiety and depression, et cetera. When it comes to children, we have a very interesting long-term study that was done. It's called the ACE study, ACE, Adverse Childhood Experiences. It traced the impact of different types of childhood experiences on children. And it found for physical, emotional, and mentally abusive homes, children have a greatly increased risk of many kinds of mental health problems later on in life, academic problems, financial problems, all sorts of other things, because that emotional foundation that gets laid literally in our brain, the neuropsychology of our brain, right, is impacted by this trauma. And so it has this, this huge long-term impact. So this is something for women who, and again, it's not always women, but often is, who feel like, no, I need to stay in this relationship for my children. He only hits me. He's providing for them. Their witnessing of that actually has a long-term impact on their mental health and even their physical health later on in life. And so it's really important to realize that. So it's really a healing from a kind of trauma. There's a lot of different pieces to it. Some of it is psychological. A lot of it that I focus on is learning the skills to work through different types of anxiety disorders that often come out of having lived in fear for so long, right? And insecurity for so long. And so then being in a kind of state of chronic anxiety, learning how to manage that anxiety through different breathing exercises, different things like that. Because people can literally get to a point where they can't go to a job interview because they're triggered into so much anxiety. And you'd be like, well, why would that be tied to having been in an abusive relationship? It's just getting into this traumatized state of constant chronic anxiety and learning to rewrite that in your mind and body to move forward.
Can you trust again? I mean, if you've been through this, I wonder myself personally, if I've been through all that and you meet, say, somebody down the line, you always have that doubt in the back of your mind. Did you become more of a protective type of individual that anybody you meet, no matter who it is, you always have that in the back of your mind?
Well, I mean, here is the sad truth statistically is that many women end up in multiple abusive relationships.
Wow.
So
okay.
So this is because then it's really, I said that abusers are very likely to have been abused as children. Well, women who are in abusive relationships are also very likely to either have grown up in a home in which they witnessed abuse or have been abused themselves, right? So again, that imprinting happens on both sides that, oh, this is just normal relationship. So even though they get out of one, then there's still this sense or some sort of draw on some level or sense of that's how a relationship is supposed to be. Now, once someone goes through the growth cycle where they feel they really own that they deserve more than that and they want to attract a different type of person, you're right. There's often a lack of trust in their ability to see it. There can be a real sense of, I can't trust anyone and I can't trust myself to judge, especially if they've had more than one relationship turn abusive. And it just takes time and it takes the right person, but it can be done. And I have seen many happy endings in that regard.
Just so our listeners know, you've two websites, so I just want to make sure I have the correct pronunciation. chakraempowermentforwomen.com and the other one is enlightenedenergetics.com. So what services do these provide? I actually read up as well that you conduct, is it teleseminars as well?
Zoom seminars these days. We're all doing everything by Zoom, right?
I'm so old fashioned.
Webinars. Yeah. They used to be teleseminars. Now they're all Zoominars, but so I do workshops and I have 2 books, one on meditation, one on chakra empowerment. Chakras are energy centers in the body and we can work with them in a meditative way. And a lot of my work is around developing daily self-care routines and tools that help reverse depressive and anxiety patterns that develop as the result of abuse. And also to heal those internal, that feeling of I can't trust anyone or I don't deserve to be in a loving relationship, or no one is ever going to want to be in a loving relationship with me, all of these kinds of things. I think in the moment are just tools that anyone can benefit from. Anyone can benefit from learning some form of mindfulness or meditation. Really what we learn to do is to just rest, whether we're focused on our breath or a chakra, an energy center. We learn to pull our mind back from our thoughts and emotions, which then in our daily life helps us stop the reactive cycle that can happen where we're getting triggered. So this, for both abusers and those victims, is part of the training. And for those abusers who do go through programs to try to transform their behavior, usually anger management, violence management programs, mindfulness and meditation is also a part of those programs because of the way that it helps you gain the ability to catch yourself when you're about to go into an old habitual angry reaction. So both for victims and for abusers, these tools are key to transformation.
And they're available, the books, I'm just making sure they're on Amazon, is that correct? We have the Chakra Empowerment for Women is on Amazon, Women's Energetics and the Art of Science of Mediation. So I have them here in front of me, just making sure.
Yeah. And they are on the UK. Yeah. And actually my publisher, Llewellyn, is really big in the UK in general. So they are on the UK Amazon too, not just the US one.
Oh, that's perfect. just so your listeners, go to Amazon there, Lisa Erickson, she's 3 wonderful books there you can get. Can I ask then, in your experience, you don't have to mention obviously names, but can domestic violence and domestic abuse occur in professionals from all industries? Or are we just specific? Because stereotypically, you know, when you watch these movies and the movies you see, you know, the family may not be well-to-do. So probably the best way to put it. We have the stereotype in our mind that usually they're non-educated or they're unemployed. Or in your experience, is it from any background that people can be abused? I'm
so glad you asked this question. It is absolutely every background, every income level. And, you know, it's interesting. There was this Netflix series that had Nicole Kidman and Reese Witherspoon. I'm not sure if it's worldwide or not, Big Little Lies.
Oh, we've heard of it, yes.
Yes. And this was in a very affluent California community. It was actually written by an Australian author. And it really was very true to life in my experience. There is abuse in very affluent communities. There is abuse in all different cultures and ethnicities. Because it really is a psychological disorder, I think would be the way to put it, right?
Yes.
In terms of the abusive personality, and exists everywhere. Now, what I would say is that we do know that incidents of domestic violence go up in a country or a community when they are experiencing financial strain. They go up anytime a community has mass layoffs. And this has been traced in many communities around the world when a particular industry, for example, when the car industry here started going under in Detroit and there were mass layoffs, there was a huge increase in domestic violence. So it is tied to financial strain in a household, right? Someone who, and it's right now in COVID, there's been a huge concern about this because children in many places are home from school, financial strain, and that does increase the possibility that there will be domestic violence.
It's interesting you said that, because especially with, I know we spoke briefly before we started our podcast, but you know, the aviation industry, transport, tourism and hospitality has been devastated by COVID-19. And yeah, it's kind of like you've hit the nail on the head there, that, you know, the possibility is that hopefully listeners can listen to this and maybe take something from it, that, you know, you're not alone, that these things will happen and may happen, and hopefully you can go and get some help.
Yeah, you know, I was just going to mention, because I'm actually raised in the Air Force, right? And then my father went into commercial aviation. So that's not in my profile, so you wouldn't know that. But I do think, you know, when I look at the military culture and the aviation culture here, and maybe it's true there as well, right? It is very macho. It is very stoic. It is, you know, reality is in those kinds of jobs, there is also a real hesitation to seek help because it can be reflected in your record, right?
Yes.
And put your job at jeopardy. So this is a huge problem, that we don't view these kinds of things as mental health in the same way that we do physical health, that
Yes.
it needs to be cared for. It shouldn't be jeopardizing someone's job, but it does need to be treated and addressed. So I really hope anyone out there that sees themselves on either side of this can find private confidential help. In most countries, therapists are bound to confidentiality, and so they are someone you can turn to, and it will not jeopardize your job.
What about then with you mentioned earlier, financial stresses and pressure could enhance the possibility of domestic abuse, but what about a life event? I mean, have you ever had a situation or a client where there seemed to be kind of a normal relationship, no issues, no problems, and then a life event has happened other than financial stress, like maybe a death, a bereavement, or a divorce? I mean, can that actually enhance the possibility as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would say is the potential for abuse is either always there or not, right? Like,
Yeah.
and then there are different stressors that can trigger it. So financial strain is always a big one, but fertility issues I've seen really take a relationship over into emotional abuse. And I would not say that caused the emotional abuse. I would say the emotional abuse was sort of lying latent as a potential there, meaning there were issues, there were mental health issues, right, on the side of one partner. And then the strain of going through that brought it to light. So I think I view it more that any sort of life event could potentially bring it to light, but it's always a sign that there's an underlying mental health issue that needs to be dealt with. Because otherwise, if you view it as situational, you're like, okay, well, now that situation passed, now we're fine. That underlying mental health issue doesn't get dealt with. The next time there's strain, it'll surface again. So you want to really address it as an underlying issue as opposed to situational.
You caught me on by surprise there with regards to your dad in the Air Force. Was he flying? Was he flying jets, or was he in a different area of the Air Force?
No, he flew my whole life. Yes, he was not abusive, by the way. I should mention that in case I applied that. But yes, but I do. But that culture, I very much understand that culture and the fears around mental health seeking, and the same with policemen. We have this in many fields, right? The fear of seeking help because of how it could impact your career.
Yeah, it's true, because there is that the fear that if it does get out. Either to the company, especially now with social media and everything else, is that you can't say anything for fear of a backlash, and especially if the company finds out, because the company finds out, then the problems then escalate, I suppose. So it really is a tough one. So can you tell our listeners? Sorry, go on, Lisa, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, so it is important to recognize that in most countries and states, therapists and healers and doctors are bound by confidentiality rules, and they do not have to share that. So you should find out is the important thing, right? Find out who's your safe space that you can turn to.
Yes, that's good advice. And men, again, I know that there was a radio show on here a few days ago, and the men were quite upset because the focus was, again, women. We understand the majority of women are encounter domestic abuse or domestic violence, but there was a few gentlemen that were kind of a little bit upset because they had experienced it well. So I want to highlight that as well, that if you have that issue or a problem, still get help.
Yeah, and in the households I've seen, that is also often accompanied, really a byproduct also, again, of alcohol abuse or addiction on the part of the woman, right? Is when it seems to be the most common. So it's combined with other issues.
It's frightening. It really is. Yeah. It's I could talk to you all day, but it's frightening. So what are then where can our listeners then get in contact with you? I know we mentioned your websites. I mean, what about your social media?
Yeah, so on Facebook, I'm under Chakra Empowerment. If that's a new word for anyone, it's CHAKRA, chakra. It's that's the word for energy centers, right? Which is a certain type of meditation and contemplative work that someone can do. Chakra Empowerment on both Instagram and Facebook. And I'm under Mommy Mystic on Twitter.
Mommy Mystic.
Mommy Mystic. Yeah. Yeah. And then from there, you'll find all my various websites, because I have a blog and the two websites that you mentioned. And of course, the books, Art and Science of Meditation and Chakra Empowerment for Women, on my website. Both of those books would be more helpful to someone working to heal after having left possibly a relationship. They're more geared around that, not so much about the advice when you're in it and how to get out.
So before we finish our chat today, what last bit of advice would you give anybody final statement to keep in their mind right now that if they're
Mhm.
suffering from domestic abuse or domestic violence, what can they do?
Don't wait. Don't think it'll pass. Don't think that there's no support or no hope or no help, because there is. Look for it. You will find it. It's out there. There is another side. There is a path through. It's very difficult, but you can get there and you'll have support and you can come out to another life. And don't stay for the children, because there really is permanent long-term damage that can result from that.
I want to thank Lisa for chatting with me today. What we'll do is put all the links in with the podcast so the listeners can get in touch with you directly. Okay, so thanks very much to Lisa Erickson for chatting with me today on Aviation United by AviationZorro. Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you, David, for highlighting this issue.
My pleasure. Thank you.